Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business on the Apple Podcast Store or on my website, leongettler.com. I'm Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 37 in our series for 2022, and today's date is Friday, October the 14th. First, I'll be talking to Oleg Vornik, CEO of DroneShield, a company that is creating local, high-tech jobs, creating a pathway for grads to get into complex engineering, AI sensor fusion, and building advanced technologies in the form of counter-drone systems right out of Sydney. These protect everything from critical infrastructure to sporting events to airports and more. And I'll be talking to ComSec Chief Economist Craig James about what's ahead in the market next week. But now, let's talk to Oleg Vornik.
Well, Oleg, tell us about DroneShield.
DroneShield is a 7-year-old business focused on detection and defeat of nefarious drones. So if you think of small drones like what you buy in JB Hi-Fi being used by criminals to smuggle contraband like cell phones or weapons into prisons, drones being used at airports or being flown at airports to stop traffic as it's quite dangerous for airplanes, and probably most topical today being used in warfare. So in the Ukraine-Russian war, both sides using drones extensively for field reconnaissance, directing artillery strikes, and general intel gathering, and dropping charges, of course, direct attack using drones, small drones as well as big ones. That's very much the kind of problem set that we focus on today.
Okay, but you work with national security and other public and private sector organizations?
That's right. Defense, Homeland Security, and intel agencies are by far the biggest set of customers we have, and other customers include airports, prisons, and other government-like kind of customers. I think and critical and utilities, like power and water utilities. I think over time, the customer set will extend towards more corporate and VIP customers, but today government agencies are a bulk of people who work with.
I believe recently you completed shipments to Ukraine, is that right?
That's right. So we made a shipment under a military aid contract to Ukraine right at the start of the war at the end of February. And we're now in discussions with a number of other government agencies in addition to the one that we worked with first time to have follow-on shipments.
And how's that business going?
Look, for Ukraine side of it, it's of course an absolute tragedy, and we are pleased to help in every way we can. So the equipment we shipped was both for detection and defeat of nefarious drones, and we look forward to providing more.
Look, on the defence side, Australia is very over-reliant on imports, aren't we?
If you look traditionally, we have very much imported American, British, and French kit, amongst others, and I think that will continue. A few years ago, Australia recognized that it's not all about just getting best kit for that moment in time, but also building sovereign industry, and this now created a fairly flourishing industry that we're proud to be a part of. Australia is a relatively small country by population, but we're actually 12th largest defense spender in the world. We cannot do everything because of our size. We're not the United States, but the government has identified certain key priorities, key areas of interest, so things like robotics, hypersonic weapons, and so forth. And our business, which is very much in that robotics, counter robotics, electronic warfare space, is part of those priorities.
So you are actually very much an Australian, homegrown defence industry company.
Very much so. So we are 60 people, about 15 in Sydney and 10 roughly in the US, with Virginia office is our gateway into the US market. 40 engineers are all based in Australia, vast majority in Sydney. The products are designed here, built here. The company ASX listed is substantially Australian owned, so we have about 8,000 Australian mum and dad shareholders. All of the directors are Australian-based, Australian citizens with a majority with Australian defence clearances. So yeah, we consider ourselves 100% Australian defence business.
I mean, this is very important because Ed Husick is really pushing to bring skilled Australians back home, and we're looking really to increase our skills base. So, what role would DroneShield play in that?
We are a high-tech defense business. There are a lot of companies fulfilling important roles, but I would consider somewhat more lower tech. So things like CNC machining, metal bending, cable looming, and so forth. We are very much at the high end of the equation. So things like FPGA engineering, waveform design, overall product design, and this requires very high skilled engineers. It took us quite some time to build the right base. We roughly doubled in size over the last 2 years, and we are continuing to slowly grow. But this is very much a talent game. I completely agree. It takes a long time to build a skill set. It's unusual to have the kind of skill sets that we require. But I suppose for us on the upside, we don't have to compete with the likes of Facebook and Amazon or SpaceX here in Australia, which makes it a little easier.
So how do you go about recruiting the talent?
There's no simple answer. So you go through a network of existing employees. So our internal referrals are a big part of the picture. We work with a number of recruiters. We advertise roles. And also over time, we build quite a bit of brand equity. So if you are in high-end defense space, chances are you heard of DroneShield, and we're very much employer of choice. The team has now been fairly stable, especially at the senior level. So for a 7-year-old business, most of the employees at this sort of a C-suite been with us for 5 years plus, and we're just continuing to build out targeted placement. So no simple answer, Liam. You just kind of have to keep looking for needles in haystacks when it comes to high-end employees.
So how many jobs have you created over the past 12 months?
Over the past 12 months, we hired probably about 5 or 7 people out of the 60 or so that we have.
And most of these would be technical roles?
Yeah, that's right. So we, in addition to technical roles, we do have corporate roles, sales roles, but even our sales roles are fairly technical in nature. So for example, the guy who runs our Australian sales got 2 engineering degrees, and that's just the nature of our work. I mean, I don't consider myself technical by DroneShield standards, but I have a mathematics degree. So because the products involve so much high technology, it's almost a requirement that you have technical background, even if you're not an engineer in the business.
So tell me, what's the future for DroneShield? What are your growth plans?
Counter-drone has come a long way from when we started. As back then, people used to say, well, why are you running this business? Drones are toys. And now I think it's pretty clear to all the customers we're talking with that it's a rapidly emerging industry. So this will continue to get larger. And US, Australia, and Europe with the Ukraine conflict are by far our largest markets, alongside of Middle East and South America and Southeast Asia. Electronic warfare and ISR are adjacent markets for us. What I mean by adjacent is it's all about looking for small nuggets of information in sea of data. So using AI to solve classic big data problems. So in counter-drone, of course, it's about detecting a drone behind signals like Wi-Fi routers and Bluetooth and so forth, and doing it quite precisely. In electronic warfare, it could mean detecting and tracking a missile or an enemy tank or frigate. And ISR tasks unrelated to drones could be potentially locking on an object with a camera and tracking it against complex backgrounds. So these are all the capabilities that we developed over the last several years, and I think will continue to grow quickly.
Do you see it moving also into other areas? I mean, obviously it has a role in airports and other businesses. So do you see that expanding as well?
100%. So airports have been somewhat slower on the uptake compared to the militaries and homeland security agencies. We recently announced the first US airport deployment, and we expect that to grow into more over time. Two most common questions customers ask when we start talking to them is how much and who else got it. So having those initial deployments is the hardest, but then you can mushroom and kind of grow the business from there. Prisons, as I already mentioned, so delivery of the contraband. US is a fascinating market because a number of individual states have 20 plus prison facilities in those states, and if you start with one, you can quickly expand across more. Power generation, including nuclear power, is a big focus for us. In Australia, there's recently been a act passed, Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which obliges critical infrastructure operators to consider all aspects of their security. So counter-drone security comes into it. So all of that is pretty key. And recently also there's been an article published by Insurance Australia magazine, which talked about potentially drone being the cause of the Ever Given ship block in Suez Canal by essentially creating a cyber attack, launching on the roof of the ship and hacking into the system and saying, X dollars in Bitcoin in the next 24 hours, so we'll run the ship into the ground. So cyber threats using drones as a delivery mechanism, I think, will be another big area.
Well, Oleg, that's all fascinating, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Leon. Much appreciate being here.
And now let's talk to CommSec Chief Economist Craig James.
Well, Craig, what's ahead of the market for the week starting October 10th?
Well, it's probably an uninspiring week or unaudacious week in terms of the domestic schedule. If you look through the releases, basically they're all basically from the second shelf or the second tier economic indicators. We've got a gauge on business spending called business turnover. That's produced by the Bureau of Statistics. That's coming out on Monday. And there's also a gauge on the job sector, the Internet Vacancy Index, that's coming out on Monday as well. Tuesday, there's a lot of focus on the Aussie consumer. There's the weekly and the monthly gauges of consumer confidence. And also on the same day, we've got the household spending indicator from the Bureau of Statistics. And then we've got household spending intentions report from CommBank. And certainly the Reserve Bank Governor said he will be looking very closely at the Aussie consumer for guidance about rate hikes, the size and the timing of rate hikes going forward. Also on Tuesday, we've got overseas arrivals and departures. On Wednesday, we've got a speech by one of the Reserve Bank officials, the Assistant Governor of Economic. So at this stage, no topic for discussion has been set down, but look closely at that one. And then later in the week on Thursday, we've got the payroll jobs and wages report. This is a more timely indicator in terms of jobs and wage trends in the economy, but economists basically haven't found a way to use it properly yet, so it certainly hasn't set the world on fire. Now, while the domestic schedule has been, looks to be fairly uninspiring, there's a greater focus in the United States markets and also in terms of China. Of course, the major focus around the world at the moment is inflation, and that's very much in focus in the United States. On Wednesday, there will be the measure of producer prices. On Thursday, consumer prices. And then on Friday, the trade prices or international trade prices, the export and import prices, they'll be coming out on Friday. Also over the week, we'll get a measure of what's happening with retail spending, so that'll be important. And also the minutes of the last Federal Reserve meeting will be released on Wednesday. That'll be Thursday morning our time. And we'll get to see what sort of discussion they're having at the moment in terms of rate settings, how many are favouring smaller rate hikes rather than bigger rate hikes and so forth. The other thing to focus on is a number of indicators coming out from China. China's got inflation figures coming out on Friday, which are producer and consumer prices. China's also got some trade figures coming out on Friday. And a day earlier, some of the lending indicators, things like money supply, new loans and loans outstanding will be released on the Thursday. So it's probably fair to say we'll be setting our sights more on terms of the United States markets and the gauges on consumer prices rather than in terms of the local indicators.
Inflation in the US seems to be powering along quite strongly.
Yeah, a major concern that inflation is holding up, despite the aggression that we're seeing in terms of central banks, particularly from the US Federal Reserve. We're yet to see sort of meaningful reductions or even early indications of significant declines in inflation. Producer prices in the United States currently, if we look at the headline measure, running at an 8.7% annualized rate. If we look at the underlying measures, stripping out food and energy, 7.3%. So both those figures are certainly super high. If we look at consumer prices, a little bit lower than the producer prices. Consumer prices, 8.3% higher than 12 months ago. Take out food and energy, and you're up in the order of 6.3%. So it doesn't matter which way you cut it, though. Effectively, the Federal Reserve is looking for 2% inflation, or perhaps 2.5%. It's currently sitting at around about 7s and 8s. So one of the other things to come out, in the coming week, particularly with inflation, the focus on Tuesday in the United States, they've got from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York the Consumer Inflationary Expectation Survey. So this gives us an idea about consumers and what they're viewing inflation at the moment. And they're currently got a reading of 5.7%. So we'd like to see that one heading south. If that one heads south in a big way, we're likely to see the headline and underlying measures, the actual prices, sort of slowing as well.
It's interesting because, last time people were talking about the Federal Reserve bringing in 100 basis points. Well, they didn't. But it would indicate, though, that for all their strong rate rises, it's not having any impact.
Yes, I suppose the point is that they talk about monetary policy working with long and variable lags. And just because you've increased interest rates, the next day it's not going to show up in terms of the economy. It takes a while for the higher repayments to be able to filter down into the ordinary consumer or business, and then for those businesses and consumers responding in terms of what they're going to cut back in terms of spending and how they're going to accommodate the higher loan repayments. So I think we're probably sort of going a little bit too hard, too fast, and not allowing sort of a degree of time for settling in. I suppose the central banks are super worried at the moment is that these higher rates of inflation, the longer that they stay high, the greater potential for them to stay locked in for a longer period of time. That's certainly something that central banks don't want to see. So I think, if anything, we are going to see central banks erring on the side of pushing economies into recession to be able to get their inflation objectives rather than tiptoeing around the place.
That's also been a major concern about the RBA.
Yes, in terms of the Reserve Bank, they've already got one wrong in terms of saying that interest rates weren't going to rise until 2024, and certainly they had to increase rates a whole lot earlier than that. The last thing they will want to see now is they're becoming too aggressive in terms of lifting interest rates, not allowing for time in checking to see how those rate hikes are impacting on the economy. Because if we go into recession, there'll be yet another new spotlight on the Reserve Bank for, again, getting it wrong, lifting rates too hard and too fast. So the central banks around the world have got to watch this situation, look at the indicators very, very closely, really pay sort of much more than the usual amount of attention, and even to some of the more, not, is it probably second tier or third shelf, third tier indicators, things like consumer inflationary expectations in the United States. They don't usually sort of justify a lot of attention, but they've got greater importance in the current environment because inflationary expectations are super important. Yesterday, as I said before, yesterday, these expectations are locked in, then it's going to be a whole lot harder to be able to get inflation down to the target band.
It would indicate, though, certainly that monetary policy does have its limitations.
Oh, it certainly does. When you think about sort of the Australian consumers, something like a third of Aussie consumers are renting. Around about a third have paid off their home loans, and a third are actually buying the home. They've got a mortgage. So you think about rate hikes, And so where the impact is really going to be felt, well, it's going to be felt in terms of a more negative area, in terms of those people buying their homes. It's in terms of renters, it could actually be more positive rather than negative, because renters are accumulating savings to be able to buy homes, and also to ensure they can meet the rent repayment, so they're keeping money in the bank. And if they're getting so higher returns on those funds, that's certainly a sort of positive indication. The other thing is those people who paid their homes, home loans out, so they own their homes outright. Those people invariably have got the money in the bank, and they want to see interest rates rise, and they benefit from that. And it supports not just their confidence levels, but it supports their actual spending levels, as well. And that's hard for the Reserve Bank, because how do you sort of target these things? You can't say to banks, you can't increase interest rates for the depositors and only increase those for the borrowers. It is the case that so the central banks have got to do some heavy lifting in the current environment.
The $64 question is, what's going to be happening with inflation?
Well, it's going to come down. That's our expectation. That's certainly the expectation of the Reserve Bank and also the government, that your hike rates are high enough and far enough and fast enough, then you are going to see an impact in terms of the economy. And particularly here in Australia, where most people have got variable loans rather than fixed loans. But even with those people on fixed loans, once we get into much later this year and into next year, we've got a large cohort of people that are having to trade. Well, their fixed loan period ends, and they're having to select either a variable loan or another fixed loan term to be able to roll over into, and they're going to see a very substantial increase in terms of their home loan repayment cost, and that's going to have a big impact on the economy. And that's something that the Reserve Bank has certainly got to keep sort of on top of their mind as well.
Right. Well, Craig, it's been fascinating to talk to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Not a problem at all.
So what's happening in the news? Well, the International Monetary Fund predicts global growth will slow to 2.7% next year, 0.2 percentage points lower than its July forecast, and it anticipates 2023 will feel like a recession for millions around the world. Aside from the global financial crisis and the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is the weakest growth profile since 2001, the IMF said in its World Economic Outlook published on Tuesday. Its GDP estimate for this year remains steady at 3.2%, which was down from the 6% seen in 2021, echoing warnings from the United Nations, the World Bank and many global CEOs. The IMF downgraded its expectations for Australia's economy, tipping it to grow by 1.9% through 2023, with inflation to average 4.8% next year. In April, the IMF was forecasting the local economy to grow by 2.5% next year, with inflation around 2.7%. And the post-COVID recovery has rapidly run out of steam, as many countries hit or near the brink of outright recession amid heightened uncertainty and rising risks, a new economic analysis has warned. The latest twice-yearly Brookings Financial Times Tracking Index found that growth momentum, as well as financial market and confidence indicators, had deteriorated markedly in recent months, as soaring prices and geopolitical uncertainty fuel lead economic pessimism across the world's major economies. Confidence indicators have fallen sharply and are at all-time lows since the index began over a decade ago in countries including the US, UK and China. In emerging economies, which are more exposed to rising food and energy prices, confidence has fallen even more sharply. The United Nations last week warned that developing nations, in particular those in Asia, could bear the brunt as monetary and fiscal policies in advanced economies, including continued interest rate hikes, push the world towards a global recession and stagnation. Eswar Prasad, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, said the index's findings reflected a series of self-inflicted wounds by businesses and governments, ranging from Britain's financial turmoil after the announcement of major unfunded tax cuts and China's zero-COVID policy. Prasad said energy supply disruptions were fueling inflation and constraining growth in European economies, with prospects of energy shortages in the winter damaging private sector confidence. Boris Johnson is a politician who went bust in July when his Conservative Party colleagues forced him to resign as Prime Minister. Boris Johnson, the business, on the other hand, is about to make a small fortune. Political observers in England expect that Boris Inc. will follow the path of previous British leaders and become a one-man private corporation offering two products, a memoir and speeches. A born performer who offers a singular mix of gravitas and jaggery, he will market qualities that once charmed millions of voters, including a shambolic head of blonde hair and an impish smile that says, "I won't take anything too seriously until I absolutely must." What he won't do, a biographer predicts, is immediately angle for a return to power, or criticise his successor, Liz Truss, who has managed to crater both her poll numbers and the British pound in just a few weeks in office. If he chooses to, he will join the lecture circuit at an ideal moment. The most lucrative live events, like corporate conferences and annual meetings, have come roaring back in recent months after a 2-year hiatus caused by the pandemic. In late September, the Clinton Global Initiative held its first in-person conference since 2019, as did Fast Company's Innovation Festival. Mr. Johnson is expected to fetch as much as $250,000 per speech, and even more for his first outing or two, say executives at speakers' bureaus. Because he remains a Member of Parliament, he will need to report that income publicly through what is called the Register of Members' Financial Interests. In 2019, after he quit the Foreign Secretary post, he reported earning £122,000, that's $132,000, from Living Media in India for a 3-hour speaking engagement, a payday he is likely to routinely exceed now. And more than ever, he needs the money. A 58-year-old with 2 divorces, a 3rd wife and 6 children, Mr. Johnson earned £157,000 as Prime Minister, about $178,000. Along with those high overhead costs, the man has expensive tastes. When he and her 3rd wife redecorated their official residence at number 11 Downing Street, an invoice leaked to the Independent showed that their work cost £200,000, that's $226,000, including a £3,675 drinks trolley and a pair of sofas that cost more than £15,000. Mr. Johnson was accused in news reports of using Conservative Party donations to cover some of the renovations, and he repaid the money. For the biggest paydays for speeches, he'll need to leave the United Kingdom. And former US Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke has won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, along with 2 other US-based economists for their research into the fallout from bank failures. Mr. Bernanke, Douglas Diamond and Philip Dybvig were given the nod for having significantly improved our understanding of the role of banks in the economy, particularly during financial crises, as well as how to regulate financial markets, the jury said. Mr. Bernanke, 68, the chair of the US Federal Reserve between 2006 and 2014, was highlighted for his analysis of the worst economic crisis in modern history, the Great Depression in the 1930s. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers has warned that a big and widening gap between the Reserve Bank of Australia's cash rate and other global central banks risks driving down the Australian dollar, pushing inflation higher and forcing interest rates to rise more than expected. Speaking ahead of flying to Washington for the G20 finance ministers meeting and annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, Dr. Chalmers said blunt, brutal and in some ways necessary global rate rises would push many advanced economies into recession. We're headed for a substantial global downturn and we won't be immune from that, he said, though it was not his expectation Australia would suffer a similar fate and a recession would not be forecast in the October budget. Chalmers said while it was clear the global economy was deteriorating, he believed Australia was in a strong position to defy a local recession. He said the downgrade to global growth had implications for Australia's GDP and unemployment forecasts. And the Australian dollar is being steamrolled by world recession fears. Mounting global recession risks and rising coronavirus cases in China sent the Australian dollar to its lowest level in 2.5 years on Monday, as the US dollar resumed its domination of the foreign exchange market and traders sought safe haven. The Australian dollar could fall below US 62 cents this week, according to Commonwealth Bank, as financial markets brace for the latest snapshot of US inflation due on Thursday. The currency slumped to US 63.04 cents at Monday's session low, which is the weakest cross rate since April 2020. The US dollar rose against major currencies and held its lead after positive jobs data in the US on Friday reinforced the case for the Federal Reserve to stick to its aggressive interest rate path. And underlying inflation is set to surge above 6% in the September quarter, the fastest pace since December 1990, according to the latest National Australia Bank Business Survey. NAB Group Chief Economist Alan Oster said a result of that magnitude would indicate a considerable acceleration and broadening of inflation in Australia that would ultimately put pressure on interest rates. And Alinta has warned that Australia faces a new cost of living shock, with power prices forecast to soar by at least 35% in 2023, as the early closure of coal-fired electricity generators creates a rocky energy transition. With households already reeling from 6 consecutive interest rate hikes and double-digit food inflation, the nation's 4th largest electricity retailer has predicted a steep hike in electricity tariffs amid a global supply crunch. The huge jump in electricity and gas costs echoes soaring prices in the UK, which prompted protests and consumers to burn their energy bills. Households have already been slugged this winter with an increase in their power bills of hundreds of dollars as tight supply pushes up wholesale electricity prices and Russia's invasion of Ukraine inflates international commodity markets. AMP chief economist Shane Oliver said if Valentin's predictions were realised, it would add an extra 0.6% to inflation and put pressure on the Reserve Bank to be more aggressive in raising interest rates. Australian Industry Group Chief Executive Ines Willox said business leaders would not be surprised by Valentin's forecast. We're just at the start of the price rises and more pain is to come, Mr Willox said. The market thinks energy prices will be lower beyond 2023 and that renewables will keep displacing coal and gas, but that doesn't look as though it will happen fast or as quickly as it should. Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry Chief Executive Andrew McKellar said higher power prices threaten the viability of industry and will hurt households. And Solomon Lew is on a collision course with Myer after rejecting a direct request from the retailer's chairwoman, Joanne Stevenson, to stop increasing his shareholding unless he makes a takeover bid for the entire company. Mr Lew, already the company's largest investor, has also refused to commit to a majority independent Myer board, as requested by the department store chair. The dispute was outlined in an annual meeting notice released by Myer on Monday, in which Premier Investments, a retailer controlled by Mr Lew, has nominated Myer Grace Brothers boss Terence McCartney for the board. Mr McCartney is director of Premier Investments, and the Myer board has declined to make a recommendation to shareholders on whether to support or reject his election. Myer annual meetings have in the past descended into public disputes, including in 2020, when the company's then chairman, Gary Hounsell, was forced to quit only hours before the start of the meeting, after it became clear Mr Lew and other investors would not support his re-election. Premier Investments, with a 23% stake in Myer, could now push Ms Stevenson to step aside. AGL Energy's largest investor, Mike Cannon-Brookes, has launched a campaign to convince shareholders to vote for board renewal after the power giant batted away its proposal for a string of new director appointments. The energy company's board said on Friday it would support the nomination of only one of the four directors nominated by Mr Cannon-Brookes, Mark Trudell, setting AGL up for a showdown with the Atlassian billionaire at its November 15 annual meeting. Mr Cannon-Brookes wrote to investors on Tuesday saying it would soon mail out instructions on how to vote for its favoured directors at or before the meeting. Grok believes each independent candidate will bring unrivaled experience and capability to AGL's board. For this reason, we're encouraging all AGL shareholders to vote in favour of Christine Holman, Professor John Pollier's OAM, Dr Kerry Schott AO and Mark Trudell, Mr Brooks said as part of his private vehicles campaign. We believe the existing AGL board needs help, particularly with executing on strategy and fresh ideas. Today, AGL only has 5 directors on its board. We consider this unacceptable for a company of AGL's scale, let alone a company that has failed to keep up in a rapidly transforming industry, the letter reads. Grok said the candidates will not be its representatives if elected and will both consider decisions and vote independently. It accused AGL's strategic review released in late September as failing to align the company with the 1.5-degree Paris climate outlook. And the Prudential regulator said it's only a matter of time before one of the nation's financial institutions is hit with a cyber attack. Australian Prudential Regulation Authority Chairman Wayne Burrs, speaking at a parliamentary committee hearing on Tuesday, said the financial sector had made huge amounts of investment in cyber defence as he singled out cyber and climate risks as among the biggest challenges facing the financial system. But a cyber attack on one of Australia's financial institutions will happen at some point in the future, he warned. Financial institutions, at least in the broader context, are quite advanced in cybersecurity, but what we also know is that at some point some sort of event will happen. It doesn't matter what sort of defences you put in place, he said. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has shelved plans to amend the Stage 3 tax cuts in the October 25 budget on the basis that it was too politically risky to break a promise so close to the last election. Although the government has yet to rule out paring back the tax cuts before they begin in July 2024, the weight of opinion inside Labor against breaking a key promise and the political backlash put an end to a possible move in the October budget, led by Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Despite the backlash, Mr Albanese and his ministers again refused to rule out definitively paring back the tax cuts at subsequent budgets before the tax cuts begin. Instead, they repeated the talking point distributed to all MPs last week, instructing them to say only that the government's position has not changed. And Optus will undergo a new regulatory probe into whether it took reasonable steps to protect the personal data of 9.8 million Australians, which a hacker stole last month and brutally posted for sale online. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner said on Tuesday it had begun its investigation. The OAIC's investigation will focus on whether the Optus companies took reasonable steps to protect the personal information they held from misuse, interference, loss, unauthorised access, modification or disclosure the OAIC said, and whether the information collected and retained was necessary to carry out their business, the regulator said. It comes amid intense debate over whether the Optus breach was simple, as argued by the government, with an unprotected application programming interface leaving it vulnerable to attack, or if the hack was more sophisticated, as Optus says. The telco has engaged Deloitte to review the breach, but will not publish the findings. The OAIC said its investigation would be coordinated with telco regulator, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which is also investigating the breach. The inquiry will be coordinated with one conducted by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which will investigate Optus's obligations regarding customer information as a telecommunications provider. Chair of the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, said scammers were taking advantage of the large-scale data breach and posing as a telecommunications giant, or Equifax Protect, the credit reporting agency tasked with supporting victims of the breach, to swindle consumers. She told the Parliamentary Committee people were confused about the legitimacy of the communications. So far, Ms Cass-Gottlieb said there had only been a few instances of fraudsters successfully scamming victims out of money by pretending to be from Optus. The consumer watchdog has been flooded with Optus-related scam complaints following the data breach. And Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, has announced it is helping to tackle the growing threat of cyber attacks facing Australia by providing free research and development support to businesses working in the cybersecurity sector. The CSIRO said today that small and medium-sized enterprises working on new cybersecurity solutions can join the free 10-week online Innovate to Grow program being offered to support their idea with research and development. And on completion of the program, participants may be able to access support through CSIRO to connect to research expertise nationally, along with dollar-matched R&D funding. Under the program, business will also tap into CSIRO's own cybersecurity expertise through Data 61. CSIRO's data and digital specialist arm, and be exposed to industry knowledge, hear from innovation and industry experts, and work with an R&D mentor. And that's it for this week. And next week I'll be talking to Renee Thornton, General Manager of Rehab Management, a leading corporate health provider. According to Safe Work Australia, more than 500,000 Australians sustain a work-related injury or illness each year at an estimated cost of $61.8 billion. This impacts the health system, economy and society in a multitude of ways, including loss of productivity, income and quality of life. Workplace rehabilitation is a process of providing guidance and support to an injured worker to enable safe and timely return to work after an injury or illness. It is about finding the best ways for the worker to remain at work and be engaged with the workplace while keeping their valuable skills. And I'll be talking to economist Nicholas Gruen. In the meantime, you can catch me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. And if you want, leave a comment. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business on the Apple Podcast Store or on my website, leongetler.com. Wishing you all a safe